Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 89th video in our Master Series and the third video in our subgroup mixing. So if you've watched the last couple videos, what we're going to talk about tonight is a real simple concept of trying to make something centered but not mono so that you can get something that ends up rising above the rest of the mix that is in your face, that will not get distracted from a wide stereo field that you might have on the rest of your production. This is a very simple concept, so just make some notes about this and experiment with it. When we talk about the intraaural processing, or when I mention that, make a note that we'll talk about that in the next video, because basically the concept's really simple. If you have a really nice capture from a mono file and you've got this nice microphone, or you've resculpted it to sound like it was from a real nice microphone that we talked about, that if you just play it mono, it sounds mono. I mean, it just does. And in some situations you can get away with that, and in some situations it just sounds good like that. I'm not going to, get into a personal preference thing, because there's sometimes I do that and it sounds fine. But normally what I'll do is I'll use this technique. So if you have two mono files, that you have one file here that you've recorded with a microphone, you've sculpted, it sounds real nice, and you've either doubled it, or you've recorded the same capture with two really nice microphones, or you've made it sound like you've captured really two nice microphones. The concept of this is minor pannings. So to get away from that mono sound is you take those two tracks and you pan one 30% right, 30% left, 40% right, 40% left, anything under 50% right and left. What this does, after you do the intraaural processing that we'll talk about in the next video, which is basically really light detunings, uptunings, and really small amounts of delay, causes it to sound like a really thick, complex, rich, and full mono file. So what happens here is normally the concept is applied in a situation to where you've really done a lot of work on the rest of the production, so that everything else in the rest of the production has a really nice wide stereo field effect. I mean, it sounds really wide and thick and just full. Yeah, dude. And this lead vocal or this lead guitar or whatever you're working on sounds very centered, so that the listener either perceives it to be a very unique sounding monofile that's very rich and thick and complex, or they perceive it as like a stereo track that's been squished together some, that makes it has a very unique effect, to where basically, the idea is for the most part is that it rides above the rest of the mix a lot easier. It's very hard for the listener with this type of processing to get distracted from the other things going on in the production, because it's very centered. Not only is it louder than everything else because it's going to ride up above everything else in decibel level, but also it's very centered. So the rest of the things won't be as distracting, and there's much less of a chance of everything else in the production muddying what you want sitting out on top. So the concept is very simple, and you just need to experiment with it. We had talked about, what you can do to the other file, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in the next video, that you do the EQ a little bit different. So, I mean, we had talked about that if you don't have two different really nice microphones, and you've doubled the track or something, or you've got two microphones that aren't that good, that if you've done really good EQ work on them to make them sound as good as possible, when you go to rework the EQ a little bit, that you go along the lines of the equal loudness contour that we talked about in equalization, and change it up a little bit to where it sounds like a different, really nice microphone. You can add a little bit more even harmonics or a little more odd harmonics like we talked about in sound sculpting. You can even add some effects. You might add a little bit of flanger to one side or the other, just lightly, just a little bit, where it's hardly perceivable, but it's really changing the texture and sound of it a little bit, so that it adds a little bit more complexity to the sound. that may sound, I mean, sometimes there are times where the high end I'll just bring down a little bit, or I'll bring the low end down a little bit, or up just a little bit to make it sound thicker or richer or brassier or whatever than the other one. I mean, as you start to understand the process, and we talked about changing it up a little bit, is not that difficult. The issue that you have to really watch out for is that if I've got this mono file that I recorded in the best microphone I have, and I've done all the editing and processing that we've talked about to make it sound as good as I think it can sound. Now, those are your preferences. So to somebody, this track might sound a little bit brassy. Somebody else might process it to where it sounds a little bit warmer. So basically, when you go over to work on the other track, that you're trying to come up with something like this one's brassy, so you want this one to be a little bit warmer. Does that make sense? It's a little bit richer and warmer or something like that. That might not be your preference completely. So that means, go light on it. Don't make it really warm and really rich, because you obviously weren't thinking that would be how that vocal or that lead would sound best. But just a little bit will make it sound more complex when you mix those two together, because you have them pan 30 right and left, and the listener, or 40 right and left, and the listener is not really going to perceive that over on the right it's brassy and over on the left it's warmer, that they're getting squished together. So the sit back experience of it is that it's a thick, rich, complex mono file. So, but they won't perceive it as mono, because of you've doubled that track and done that, then it'll really sound like you've taken this mono file and made it sound like, like this really thick, rich, complex sound, or that you've taken a stereo file and squished it together some. Does that make sense? And it's a really cool effect, because basically it really promotes that in your face sound, to where you don't throw away some of the things that we're going to talk about in the next videos about, delays and tunings and changing the sound of one side or the other to add complexity to the sound and things like that. But it doesn't add this stereo field effect to it, so that it doesn't, because the wider you get in the stereo field, normally the louder you have to make it, so it doesn't get lost and muddled and muddied in from the rest of the mix. So it's a really cool concept, and a lot of times it can be your go-to concept for things that are out front vocals, lead guitars, a synth lead, or a break to where you've got a saxophone that goes ba 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 ba, or you've got this thing that's going on with a sax and harmonica that's da da da, or something going on. That is really because it doesn't sound like it's this mono file that you did. It doesn't sound like a stereo file. And it doesn't sound like you've duplicated the track and panned them way off 75 right and left to get this real rich stereo field. It's something else going on. And most of the time it comes out the effect of why you don't use a stereo or a mono track, because it doesn't sound like a mono track, and it has the effect of not getting lost in the mix as a stereo track. And so you've basically got this concept that basically is in between those two. Does that make sense? So you've really centered it and got away from the stereo track kind of sound, and you've widened it so it doesn't sound like the mono track. So, but you've kept it centered. So it's a really cool concept that you really want to experiment with, because it can really make whatever you got sitting out front really ride above the rest of the mix and be very centered, so that the listener does not get distracted by other things. And also it can become this very rich, thick, complex sound that you can do some of these other things with without it sounding like you've got this stereo track or these double tracks that you've tried to do this wide stereo thing. So the understanding of it and the whole basis of it is basically you get this out front, centered, in your face track that's got this really rich, thick, complex sound that is riding on top of possibly and more than likely the rest of the production that you've done some really cool stereo widening effects too, to where the rest of the production is like this really wide, thick, fat sound. It's just, wow, dude, really cool, wide stereo field effect, where you've got this other thing that is that, sitting on top of it in your face, that you get the best of both worlds in it to make it, as cool as you can, so that it's in your face but has a lot of the aspects of the other type of processing that you can do without losing that mono kind of effect that's in your face. So I hope I made that as clear as possible. In the next video, we'll talk about intraaural processing of a certain intraaural processing effect that is a really good place to use on this type of mixing, subgroup mixing. So watch the next video and practice doing that on it. But it's a really cool effect that can really pull you out of having to use a mono file or going to a stereo file, and pull you out of that doubling the track, or both those takes pan more than 50% right and left trying to get this stereo field. And it can really enhance the production to where it's very centered and you can really hold the listener's attention well. And on top of it, there's a lot less chance of whatever you got sitting on top getting muddied and muddled, or getting, from the rest of the production or other things distracting of it, because it's really great, because there can be other things happening. You've got a little clarinet over here goes wah wham, and the snare goes tsh, and the tom goes tink, or whatever's going on, that it's wider in the stereo field out there and quieter, where that thing is in your face but thick and wide and complex riding up above it, and it's there's a lot less chance of the listener getting distracted of it and seeing that those things are complementary but underneath it and not causing distraction, so that their mind can really hear it very well, very clearly, and it's not like really super loud above the rest of the mix, where sometimes you have to, if you do this. Some of those wide stereo techniques that we'll talk about in the next few videos after the next video, that you really have to turn it up a lot louder than the rest of the mix. Otherwise, it really gets muddied by whatever else is going on in the production, which causes a loudness problem sometimes, and sometimes it just takes a lot of fussing around, because you've got, it's like, I found myself sometimes I got to turn it up way louder than everything else, because otherwise it just starts getting muddied by the rest of the mix, and it's not clear, and it's not standing above the rest of the mix like it should. Where with this type of processing and this type of mixing, that it's guaranteed to sit on top of everything else, it's guaranteed to be centered, and it's guaranteed to be thick, rich, and you can get some really complex sounds happening there without causing it to get into this wide stereo field effect that gets lost in the rest of the mix. So I really hope you experiment with that, get out some tracks and some productions, and try it out. Ask some questions if you have some questions, but it's a really cool technique. So I hope you enjoyed this third video and our subgroup mixing, and I'll see you in the next video when we talk about doing some intraaural processing techniques to be able to trick the mind into seeing a wider stereo effect without having delay issues and things like that. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.